Hi, today I want to talk a little more about writing Java Swing programs. And in particular, I want to look at a pretty common pattern where we set up what's called a panel with various components on it and then specify how they're arranged using a layout. So the first layer in any uh, Java Swing application is typically a JFrame, which is an application window, and it has space for a title. You can add a menu in here with pull-down menus and hotkeys and all sorts of stuff. And then it has what's called a content pane, where most of the user interface is located. And there's a default content pane, but you can also create your own by first making a JPanel, putting things on the JPanel, and then putting that onto the content pane. So we're going to try to do that today. Now, as you add more components, you also have to start thinking about how to arrange these things on the screen. So you might have a couple buttons and maybe a text box, maybe a slider, who knows what. And there's different options for how you arrange those. One option is to use basically fixed positions. You give an XY coordinate, and that's where that component goes. This is somewhat discouraged in the sense that it doesn't let you adapt the application to different screens. So if you're viewing it on a phone or a laptop screen or a big desktop screen, there's no way for the hard-coded positions to know about that, and sometimes you can run into troubles. So often you want to give sort of a sense of style of how they should lay out, like these should be in a row, these should be one on top of the other, and you do that using layouts. So there's all sorts of different kind of layouts you can create in Java Swing. And you assign a layout to a JPanel. A JPanel is just a container for other components. And for example, a flow layout sort of goes left to right, but if you resize it, it can flow to the next line. There's a grid layout where you have just sort of set positions that the components fill, and something called a border layout that has sort of a big central area. It's easier to look at some of these things. So here's like a web page with these various things, and here's the border layout. Again, you can see there's things on the border basically. A box layout can go either in a vertical direction or a horizontal direction. Card layout, to be honest, I'm not really that sure what a card layout does. Flow layout kind of resizes or repositions stuff with the aspect ratio of the window. And then here's like a grid layout, and so on. So it's worth getting comfortable with some of these for sure. And as you run into different situations, you may find one works better than another. But let's look at a couple just basic ones first. Now, another thing to be aware of is that often you find yourself making hierarchies of layouts. So you have to start recognizing what these might look like. So for example, you have a JFrame with its content pane, a JPanel inside it, and maybe there's something that goes across this way, and you want all these buttons to be going horizontally. And then maybe there's some other stuff down here, but you want those buttons to be on top of this thing, so there's like a vertical arrangement here. Well, you often find that you have to put, these things in one panel, these things in another panel, and both of those grouped under a different layout in another panel. So you end up having sort of panels in between groups of things. So let's look at an example of this. Let's see, I had the same pictures as before. The key in some ways is to look at that for that hierarchy of JPanels and layouts. So if you look at something like this, my cursor has gone away, here we go. How could you make something like this without sort of positioning these things specifically in where they're supposed to go? Well, when I look at this, I actually see kind of a one group here that's maybe like a 2x2 grid, and then this thing, which is a JPanel containing those things, lines up in a horizontal line with the other two buttons, right? So you would first make the buttons, you would add them to a JPanel with a 2x2 grid layout on it. You would add that JPanel that contains the buttons to another panel, and then add these buttons as well on that panel, all in a flow layout or box layout to make them go in a line, right? And so there's one big panel. There's one big panel around the whole thing. That panel holds this panel, this button, this button. This panel holds those 4 buttons, right? So there's like layers, and it's pretty easy to get a little bit confused doing that. Okay, so I want to make, just to kind of start showing you a little bit about how this works, an app with a couple buttons and maybe a place to put out some text, and then look at how some of these layouts can change how the app behaves. Okay, so I'm going to make something called the layout panel, and again, there's different choices you can make about what you want to inherit from in order to get this sort of desired behavior. And sometimes you want a custom application, and then you might extend JFrame. In this case, I want to make a custom sort of content area, and so I'm going to make this extends JPanel. And then I'm going to take this custom JPanel and add it to just a normal JFrame. All right, so we have to import some stuff. And sometimes with the swing stuff, I get a little tired of importing every little thing, so I'm going to import all the different components, like a JButton and JLabel and JPanel and all that stuff. Okay, when we do this, it often complains about this this UID thing, and I'm just going to add a default one, and hardly needs a big Java doc for it. And again, for the most part, we're just sort of ignoring that for right now. Okay, so I have a layout panel that's going to hold some buttons. I need to make a constructor for that. Layout panel. And we want to initialize in the constructor the JPanel part of this layout panel. And we do that with the super call. This is a default one, so we don't actually need to have this line. It calls the default super constructor if you don't do anything at all. But I'm sort of putting it in there to remind us that there is an inheritance here. And in the constructor, we typically have to initialize the part that we inherit from. It was a JFrame super takes a title in. The JPanel doesn't do that, right? It doesn't have space for a title. So I need some buttons, and again, I'm going to make those as instance variables so we can access them both in the constructor and in an eventual listener. We're going to have listening for button clicks. So I'm going to have a J button. I seem to have this little say hi thing. If we hopefully click it and it says hi somehow. Let's add another one for quitting the program. And I'm going to add a JLabel. A JLabel is a place you can just display text. There are different places you can hold text, but a JLabel, it doesn't let you type in there. It just lets you display things. It also displays images, which is kind of fun. So it's a pretty general kind of place to just label something with some information. So in here, I need to make those things, right? So I'm going to construct the say hi button and give it some text that shows when it's on screen. And there's a quit. New J button. And I'm just going to say waiting here waiting for some kind of action to happen. Then we'll change it later. And let's have this output equals, oh wait, quit, I got one ahead of myself. This should just say quit. And then the new JLabel label is going to just say waiting. Okay, and okay, I got a little off track here now. It's called the JLabel. Okay, so we have these things, and we're going to add them to the panel. So before we added them directly to the JFrame content pane, which the add on JFrame does by default, in this case we're going to do something similar, and we're going to add these components to the panel that we're constructing here, right? So if I want to add, I want to call the add method from this panel. So I could say something like this: add say hi. But of course, this is optional, right? I can just say add, and that means it's adding to the object that's being constructed in this constructor, which is one of these layout panels, which is a kind of JPanel. So I inherit this add from the JPanel, right? Quit, add, output. So these all have sort of common behaviors, right? You make the component and then you add it to the panel. Okay, that's enough to kind of get started on stuff. It's not going to do anything yet, but let's start testing this. So down here in main, and again, this could be main in a different class, right? It doesn't have to be inside this class. I could be just setting up this panel for future use by other programs, and then in those classes, I can add as many of these panels as I want if I make them. So I'm going to have a JFrame. I'm going to call this the app equals a new JFrame, and give it a little layout test or something like that as a title. And then I'm going to do the app set default close operation, and I'm going to use the exit on close class variable that's defined in there. And again, that makes it so that the program actually stops when we hit close on the window, which is a nice thing. I'm going to make one of these new layout panels and add that to the app. So layout panel, I'm just going to call this panel. If you start getting more than one panel, I would really advise you to start being more careful with how you name them, not just panel 1, panel 2, but like, you know, icon, row, panel, or something like that, something meaningful, right? I'm going to only have one panel, so I'm not too worried about it. We need a new layout panel, and then in the app, I can set the content pane. Almost made it. Content pane, and I'm going to put a panel in there, right? So I'm replacing the default one with my own panel. And then we have to pack everything that's in there so it sort of sizes itself properly, and then set it to visible, right? Which is a sort of a funny way to kick it off, I think, but that's the way we do it here. Get rid of a couple extra lines. Okay, we made a frame. We added a panel, put the panel on the frame, and then made it all run. And up here, we have some buttons, and we're adding them to the panel. So if I run that, gotta move that on screen. Nothing too exciting. You know, these pretend, they look like they're gonna work, but they don't do anything. So I don't have it set up. So here's the thing, there's a default layout associated with a panel. It's a flow layout. Notice it kind of keeps itself centered, and then if I make it too small, it flows to kind of fill the vertical space instead of that. So there's some nice behavior here, and hopefully you can see in some ways how this would allow it to be work on different kinds of screens. So the default one's not so bad. All right, I'm gonna close that. Let's make it do something before we start experimenting with the layouts a little bit more. So in order to do that, along with extending the JPanel, we need to implement action listener. And again, an action listener responds is an interface that gives a method that we must define in order to respond to events. And I need to import some stuff for this. Import it up there. And now it's complaining that I need to implement things that are in the abstract methods in the interface. So I'm going to add unimplemented methods, and that's down here. So when some kind of event happens, that generates this event object, and the event object knows some stuff about how that event happened. So I can test that to decide what to do. So I'm going to use this getSource method, and if it's equal to say hi, in other words, the thing that generated the event was the say hi button, then what should I do? I'm going to change the output label, set its text to be hi, right? if the source get source is equal to quit, then I'm going to do a system exit to show that we're done. That kills everything off, basically. And, well, those are sort of only 2 buttons, but you know, you can continue doing more. Then if I run it, of course, and I'm just going to do this because I do this every time. I'm like, okay, I have code, right? Nothing happens. What's wrong? In your mind, you must really lock down this idea that when you have an action listener, you implement the action perform method, but then you need to add the action listener to the, oops, wait, up here. I made these buttons, but they don't know what to do. I need to tell them, so I need to say hi, add action listener, and I'm going to add the object that has implemented this method. The object that has implemented this method is the layout panel that I'm constructing, which in the class code is referenced through this, right? So I'm going to say use the action listener, the action, I always forget the name of this thing, action performed. Use the action perform method that is associated with this object being constructed. And I'm going to do that for say hi and for quit. So both share the same action listener. So sometimes you can have custom like buttons, and they're going to have their own action listener. Sometimes you have panels with an action listener. There's different ways of distributing this around, and we'll talk more about that as we see more options like this. Okay, so I've added the action listener to the buttons. That means when they're clicked, it generates an event. I see which one was actually clicked, and I do something specific based on that. Okay, so do say hi and quit. Now, there's actually something a little bit unsatisfying, I think, about this. Notice the sort of spacing here. When I say hi, it actually sort of it restructured itself to match the new smaller text. And there are actually a couple different ways of getting around this. You can set these like size hints, and you can set some bounds. I'm going to try a different layout that has a slightly different behavior, and maybe will help us with this particular issue. So I'm not making any custom layout here on this. I'm in this panel, and I want to do that. So once I make the buttons, I'm going to make a grid layout, and I have to import it. And I'm going to call this grid, and it's a new grid layout. And grid layout has some particular constructor. You have to say how many rows and how many columns you want. And actually, I'm not even sure of the order, but I'm doing 2 by 2, so it doesn't matter. And then there's a way to add a little space between the rows and columns so they don't like jam up against each other a little bit. And I think that's in pixels. So I've made the grid layout, and now I have to set it on this panel I'm constructing. So there is in JPanel a set layout method, but it's not a class method, it's an instance, right? So I really want to call it from the object, or just by default it's still called from this. So I'm going to set on my JPanel, I'm going to set this grid layout. Okay, and that's really all there is to it. It's a little bit funny in the sense that you set the layout on the panel, and then you add other components to the panel. You don't add it to the layout. And in fact, that varies. Different UI systems have different ideas here. So you'll see that some, you make the layout and then you add the components to the layout, and you add the layout to the panel. Others, the layout's like a property of the panel, and so you set it, and then as you add things to the panel, it respects the layout. All right? And I can't say there's a right or wrong answer, but it's sort of hard to remember what you should be adding where. Okay, so if I run this now, notice we have a different layout, right? It was 2 by 2, so it added 2 things, and then when it added the third thing, it had to go down to the next row. and I say hi, like that. Somehow I feel like, let's change the order of this a little bit. So we put in the say hi, we put in the output, so it'll go further along the same row, and then quit will be on the next one. So I'll run it again. Okay, so we have these buttons. I'm gonna click say hi. I'll say, notice at this point, it determines how big these cells are of this grid, right? So when I changed the text here, it didn't like reposition everything, and that was kind of nice, I think. And then when I hit quit, that's good. You can change this to do different kinds of behaviors, right? I know there's 3 things, so like a 1x3 should hold everything. Say hi. Notice again, I changed the text there and it didn't shrink everything together, which was nice. I'm gonna get rid of the, well, I'm gonna comment out this again so we can now again remind ourselves what it looks like with the flow layout, which is the default. So here we have these, and then I hit say hi, and it kind of repositions itself, right? If these are all just buttons that stay the same size, flow layout's great. And again, you kind of overcome it with some effort with these sort of size hints and things. But I think for some combination, like you have some output showing, you know, how much gold in your game there is or how many lives you have left. If you're using this kind of form to do it in, something where you can control the size of each cell a little more specifically has some advantages, right? It seems a little nicer like that. Okay, so that's really it. And the main concepts here I want to talk about again are that in this case we haven't used a JPanel before. A JPanel is just a holder of other things. It typically doesn't have its own behavior. And then, so we extend that, we implement the action listener on it. We have some instance variables that are other components we're going to put onto that panel. We construct our custom panel, right, that inherits from JPanel. We make some buttons, we add a layout, we add the buttons to the panel, we add the action listener to the buttons, and then in main, and again from anywhere really, we can make a new application of some kind. We add this custom panel to be our content pane, and then we show the whole application. As this gets more complicated, again, you might find in here you have another panel with its own layout direction, maybe a different direction, and its own components. So you have this thing going this way, and then you have something going this way, and you have a hierarchy of panels. And you'd add this panel to this panel, and then things inside that panel get added as well. Okay, so all these things take a little practice to figure out how to use, and there's a lot of components, but the important thing I think to find is are some patterns that work, and try to make sure you sort of do all the parts, right? Make the elements, make the layout, add them, add the action listener. Should be good. All right, thanks, bye.